Good morning. It is good to be with you again. It's been about a year, so it's good to see you and to be here. And I've been encouraged during our time here so far, and it's really good to hear how things are going really well. That's always good when you're going to congregations and they like their preacher and they're saying good things about them and they're growing and things like that. It's always really good to hear. So I'm going to go ahead and jump in because I have a lot to say and not a lot of time to say it. This morning it is appropriate to give thanks for what you've done. And Paul in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 is going to offer thanksgiving. And since this is Bible class, I do want to dig into the text together because I'm more of a preacher than reporter, I guess I would say. And this letter, 1 Thessalonians, is interesting because Paul is writing to a very young congregation. People who are very immature in the faith. But it's interesting because many of the things that he says are things that congregations who are seemingly very mature still need to hear. And ultimately he's going to commend these brothers and sisters for three things: their work of faith, their labor of love, and their steadfastness of hope. And if you look throughout this letter, you're going to find that Paul frames the letter by these three things, and he's going to frame the letter by three prayers. But the thesis or the proposition that Paul makes is found in 1 Thessalonians chapter 1. And he's going to say in verse 9, "We've heard about this report of what kind of reception we had with you and how you turned to God from idols to serve a living and true God." And this is his thesis. This is his main point, that once you were living as idol, or you were serving idols and idolaters, and now you are Christians and you are called to a higher standard. And at the end of 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, he talks about a bunch of random things. It seems like he says, rejoice always, pray without ceasing, in everything give thanks. And when I think about this verse, it's much harder than maybe what it seems to appear on the surface. In everything. Giving thanks is easy. But giving thanks in everything is not easy at all. So in everything, give thanks, for this is the will of God in Christ Jesus concerning you. When I read this, I think about God's will. Oftentimes when we think about God's will, we say, well, it's God's will for you to be baptized, or God's will for you to come to church, or God's will for this and God's will for that. We oftentimes don't think that it's God's will for us to be thankful people. And I always thought I was thankful until I met a man named Jeremiah for the first time. And I went to Jeremiah's house, and he had nothing. And when I say nothing, I guess he had something. He had about one handful of rice or corn, I don't remember exactly which it was, to feed him and his 8 or 9 children. We carried Jeremiah to the market, and we bought a 220-pound bag of corn. And trust me, I know it was 220 pounds because I tried to carry that thing, and it was rough. It didn't get very far, as you can imagine. Out, for some reason they moved it from this bag to this bag. I don't know why you don't just keep it in this bag and take it. But instead you scoop it all from this bag to put it in another bag that looks exactly the same. And in the process, you can tell that they spilled some corn on the ground. And Jeremiah, knowing that he has 220 pounds of corn in this one bag over here, begins to pick up every single kernel. It's like, this is a good lesson for me. And this morning, this is not just about Tanzania. I want to encourage all of us to be more thankful for what God has provided. There's three main things that we do in Tanzania. The first thing that we do is evangelism. And in 2 Corinthians, and I'm going to talk about this because it's one of my favorite passages. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, we'll begin in verse 1. And may say some things that you don't necessarily like, but I don't mean it in a mean way. I just want to encourage you. Verse 1. Therefore, since we have this ministry. If you're like me, you do this daily Bible reading stuff and you just read over this stuff so fast. But Paul says something very important here. We have this ministry. You say, well, why does this matter? Because I know this congregation here is very involved in a lot of different things. Many things. You can go and you look at the boards and all this kind of stuff. You can get on the website. You hear what is going on. And if you're not careful, it's easy to fall into the cracks and not feel like you have purpose. But Paul says we have this ministry. What Paul does is he takes ownership of something. So what I want to encourage you to do as well, find something that you can help with. And lead in that area and say, well, this is my ministry. Not being selfish or arrogant, but something that I'm going to take on and I'm going to do and I'm going to accomplish and make sure that it's going to grow the church. He goes on and he says, we have renounced these things hidden because of shame, not walking in craftiness. And notice this, not adulterating the word of God. That's key. Let's skip down to verse 4. In whose case the God of this world has blinded the minds of the unbelieving. In Tanzania, we study the Bible with a lot of people. And unfortunately, at the end of most of those studies, they say, I know what I need to do, but I don't want to do it. Or I'm not going to do it. You know, that's not unique to Tanzania, is it? How many of you over the past year or two, hopefully some of you at least, have had studies with people, and at the end they say, well, I know what I need to do, but I don't want to do it. And if you're like me, you get quite discouraged by that. You work so long on encouraging somebody and just helping somebody and trying to be a good example, and they say, in other words, I don't care. It's not good enough. It's not enough. I'm not convinced. And maybe you wonder why. And that's the big question for me. I always ask the questions that Christians tell you not to ask. And most of the time, we say, don't ask the question why. Just take it for granted. It's God's will. Well, I like to ask the question why. And the only thing, and it's not really comfort, but the only thing I can really come up with is that Satan is God of this world. And notice it says, he is blinding the minds of the unbelieving. And this morning I want to encourage you because Satan is not only blinding the minds of the unbelieving, but he's also trying to blind the minds of Christians. And he's pretty good at it. So the first main thing that we do in Tanzania is evangelism. And unfortunately, this year we spent all year working with one congregation pretty much with our evangelism efforts. We worked and baptized several people, and then their preacher decided he wanted to be a Pentecostal and misled almost every person that we baptized. So right before I was coming back to America, as you can imagine, I was pretty discouraged. And I got a phone call from Jeremiah one day, and an email and several other phone calls and some text messages and Facebook messages and a lot of other stuff too. And he informed me that a congregation was started due to the trip that John and Clint took to Tanzania. And I found out that this guy went back to his home village that John studied with at a leadership conference there. He went back to his home village. He began to have Bible studies, and this is an old Pentecostal preacher converted to the church. And now that congregation has over 40 people within like 2 months. This other congregation that we worked all year with didn't have 40 people. So, in the end, God has really blessed the work in Tanzania, but it's not without difficulty. And I'm going to talk more about that trip later on because it's something that I don't know that you understand the value of sending people to Tanzania, but we'll get to that. The second main thing that I do is teach at the School of Preaching. And this takes up a lot of time. For example, this next year I'm teaching like 6 classes, which you say, well, that's not much, that's 18 hours. But in Tanzania we have 6-hour classes. So it's like teaching 12 classes instead of 6 classes. So it's a lot of work involved in that. And it's interesting because Paul, in his final testament, so to speak, his final letter that we believe he wrote is 2 Timothy. And if you read 2 Timothy in that light, thinking about this is maybe the last thing that Paul said, especially to a young preacher, somebody who's growing in the faith. And evidently, Paul is quite concerned about sharing the gospel. And concerned about finding good people who are willing to step up and be entrusted with this message and who are going to take the responsibilities and the opportunities very seriously. So, Maybe you wonder, how in the world does you teaching at Andrew Conley make a difference in my life? I'll go on a quick story, and then I'll connect back to that. Over this past year, I had 2 grandparents die while I was in Tanzania. I was 8,000 miles away. It was pretty challenging. And I wondered and began to think back, what were the last words that each grandparent said to me? It doesn't really matter for your purposes. And then I began to think about certain people that I've come in contact with, and overall, when I think about their life in general, what did it stand for? And then I began to think about, well, if I was diagnosed with cancer, for example, and I knew I was going to die, what would be my last words to somebody? And then I began to reread 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 2. And I took it much more serious. Because this is Paul's last plea to get somebody willing to step up and do something instead of just sitting in the pew. And that's how it makes a difference for you. Paul's not saying you can be a Christian by just sitting here and crossing your arms and listening to a 40-minute sermon. It sounds good, and we like that because it's easy. But Paul's last words don't say sit in the pew and be happy and smile and then go home and then come back next week. Here's our most recent graduation. These guys are in the Swahili track. And if you ever come to Tanzania, you'll find out it's not important to be smart, but to look smart. So these guys look real smart. I don't know how smart some of them are, but they look real good. And these are our English track students. And I apologize for how dark this picture is. It's a little challenging to take pictures of them and get them exposed correctly. But a lot of these guys are from Kenya. Some are from Tanzania. We also have some people coming from South Sudan next year. So that's pretty exciting. And the third main thing we do is benevolence. And I want to encourage you in this as well, because I got to Tanzania and you get asked for money all the time, just to be blunt about it. And I began to get burned all the time. People saying they needed money for something and then they wouldn't use the money for that. And I want to relate this to you because oftentimes maybe you see homeless people or you have people that have issues that you want to meet and you've been burned. And you say, well, I'm not going to help them because they're going to be like everybody else. They're going to burn me. I want to encourage you, don't become so abrasive that you have that attitude and that mentality. Because I quickly realized in Tanzania that, a lot of people are out to get me, to burn me, and just to get money and go blow it. But there are some people who do have the right heart. And I like this picture right here because I'm reminded that instead of giving handouts in the church, we need to give a hand up. It's easy just to give out a bunch of money. It's a lot harder to give somebody an opportunity and to give them a hand up. And as you look at this next picture, this is a good example of this. This is Angela's foundation for her house in this picture, and then here is her house. And you say, well, why does that matter? Well, let me explain something, especially the women will appreciate this. In Tanzania, if you are a woman and you don't have a husband, you'll basically starve to death. Especially if you've been married and you have children and then your husband either leaves you or he dies. You're basically going to starve unless somebody helps you. And Angela's situation, she was married to a guy. He began to beat her. He was alcoholic. And it was a very abusive relationship. She said, get out. It's better for me to live alone than it is to have to deal with you, in other words. And Angela has been a very faithful member to the church, so we decided to help her. We've also been able to help many other people over the past year. In 2 Corinthians, Paul is defending his ministry and defending his apostleship. People are claiming to be super preachers or super apostles. And Paul's saying, if you don't think I'm a good preacher, then you're not a good member because I'm the one who originally preached to you. He says, you are my letters. You're the one who is commending me to other people. He says, I don't need to write a recommendation letter for myself because people can look at the congregation that I work with And it says a lot about the preacher, and that's true even today. The congregation here is a reflection on the preacher and the elders and the leadership. I have a question for you. When is the last time you woke up in the middle of the night worried about the church? When's the last time you woke up at 1 or 2 in the morning and you couldn't go back to sleep because you were so concerned about the future of the church here? Yeah, probably never. Now, you may have woken up and been concerned about finances or concerned about somebody's health or concerned about a lot of different issues. But most of us do not have worry or anxiety for the church. But in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 28, Paul says this, apart from such external things, there is this daily pressure on me for all the churches. And maybe you wonder, well, how serious is Paul when he says, I'm concerned about the church? What does he mean when he says this daily pressure? Well, Paul doesn't say this just randomly. If you go back up to say verse 22, he says, are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they descendants of Abraham? So am I. Are they servants of Christ? I speak as if insane. I more so, and far more labors and far imprisonments, beaten times without number, often in danger of death. Notice verse 24. 5 times I received from the Jews 39 lashes. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. All this stuff. Now, most of us, we come to church, and if somebody says something wrong to us or doesn't greet us with, how are you this morning, we get offended and don't come to church anymore. What if Paul would have had that mentality and that attitude? Well, over there in whichever city, I was beaten, and thankfully they stopped at 39 because they didn't want to make a mistake. He didn't say, I think I'll just quit. He kept going. And as Christians, we need to have this daily pressure or daily worry on us for the church. And if you don't, the future of the church here is not very bright. And it's not just 2 or 3 people in the congregation that has this worry or concern. It's not just the eldership or the deacons. It's every single member. Let's quickly talk about this because this is going to lead into the next part. In Tanzania, we have a huge problem. There are only 2 congregations in the entire country that have elderships. Now, let me remind you that Tanzania is not a small place. We have millions and millions and millions and millions of people. I think it's up to like 1/5 the population of America. And we have 2 congregations, 2, with elders. And as far as I know, I don't even think one of those congregations has biblical men leading the church as elders. But this year, we had the leadership conference, and we didn't specifically focus on elderships as we did last year, but we focused on church problems. Because something that we're facing in Tanzania are many of the same church problems that you read about in the book of 1 Corinthians. And many of the same church problems that the people and the members here have combated for a long time. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 10, you have, and let me just explain the situation in Corinth. You have some very rich, elite Christians. People who think really good about themselves, who really pride themselves on being a higher class citizen than all these other people. And ultimately, these are the people who are suppressing these poor Christians. And you can find this because they're participating in immoral activity and sexuality and eating all these foods that they shouldn't be involved with, all this kind of stuff. And basically they're saying, well, look how good we are, and you're not able to do what we're able to do. Sorry about your luck. And we think that even with the Lord's Supper issue in chapter 11, that most likely these rich Christians were eating in the best part of the house, and then you were putting the poor Christians who are struggling, well, you put them outside in the cold, which is not near as cold in Corinth as it is here. But, you get the idea. And in chapter 1, verse 10, he says, I exhort you, brothers, by the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that you all agree. I'll stop right there for a second. This word agree is important. Because in our culture, We don't agree on anything most of the time. And then when we do agree, we say we agree to disagree. It's ridiculous. This is not what Paul intended for the church. But unfortunately, we have brought this mentality from the outside. We'll just agree to disagree. It's okay in the church. Paul says, I want you to agree and be of the same mind, that there be no divisions among you, but that you be made complete in the same mind and the same judgment. And notice, if we don't agree, this same mind and same judgment and this completeness does not come. So this year, for TLC, we went throughout the book of 1 Corinthians and talked about all these problems. And this is when John was able to study with Matthew from Mongolia. And I'm going to come back to that again in a minute. But, when Clint and John got there and they got off the plane, first of all, I messaged Clint and I said, how are things going? He's like, we're at the front of the line. Things are going good. And I said, until they put you at the back of the line. And then 2 or 3 minutes later, he messaged me and said, well, they just put us at the back of the line. So that was the start to their trip. And I always laugh because I think you sent Clint and John as scapegoats. In other words, if they get slaughtered, then we know that we won't go. But if you come, you won't die and we will feed you. And those are two main things that people are concerned about. We're not going to let the Muslims get you. John was concerned. I'll talk about that in the sermon hour, about John's fear. And then, it's interesting because most Tanzanian men are real small and skinny, and John's walking around like this. So you can see that in the picture. People always also ask about the water. People get there and you make ice for them and they say, can I eat this? Can I eat this ice? And can I put this in my water? Well, no. Do you think you're going to come all the way to Tanzania and we're going to give you typhoid ice and let you die? We're not that irresponsible. We don't have typhoid water or anything, and you're probably going to be okay. You may see some monkeys while you're eating, and people say, well, am I going to get rabies from the monkeys? You have a better chance that your neighbor's dog bites you on the ankle and you get rabies that way. So you'll probably be okay. And you can ask John and Clint about riding in our car. It's a small, but it's not quite as bad as riding in this thing here. They have 2 layers of goats and then people sitting on top of that. And then for those of you that follow politics, and John was also excited about this, Donald Trump is represented here. He's on the back of the public transportation. We also have one of him and Kim from North Korea side by side. So whatever you think about that. And if you don't like Donald, we also have a shop that's called Hillary Clinton is now president. So you'll be happy about that. And the other side, if you don't like Hillary or Donald, we have Bill Clinton shop as well. So anyways. But the main thing is this, and I think that Clint and John both can attest to this: lives will be changed. And I can think of 40 people right now, and their lives have been changed due to the trip that was taken by Clint and John. I love this picture here because this is the result of their trip. After they came home, and I went to this place. It's called the Hazabi tribe in this area. I got out of the car, and these people began clicking. It was interesting. And then they began circling around my car with bows and arrows. And they're clicking, and they have baboon skin as shirts. And they're just acting like fools. And I look up, and there's people running out of the caves because this is their house. I'm thinking, might not make it. I'm the scapegoat in actuality. But then we kept driving, and we come up to this desert land, basically. I felt like, in the book of Acts, there's no water here, and I don't know what you do to baptize somebody. We come up to this desert place, and there's this tree. And I hear people singing, and they say, we're here. What? We're out in the middle of the desert. There's nobody here. There's no houses or nothing. You can hear the sinking. And you walk up and closer. I was able to snap this picture of the beginning of the church in Mongolia. And this is the guy who was a Pentecostal preacher who's now a preacher in the church. And this is something that I'll never forget, and I hope that you'll remember the impact that sending people from here had on the work in Tanzania. Because this is something you say, well, if they wouldn't have come, couldn't you have just done the Bible study and the same result would have happened? Well, guess what I was doing as they were having this Bible study? I was in the conference teaching and listening to other people. I would have never had to study. I think God knows what He's doing. You know, oftentimes we don't think about providence enough, but I think God knows what He's doing.
Amen.
And I don't know if Clint does this here, but in Tanzania, he oftentimes said this, keep the main thing the main thing. And this morning, I'm not going to elaborate on this, but I think it's something that we should consider together. That we do need to keep the main thing the main thing. So now, some of you will fall asleep because you've already been asleep. You're just falling into the deeper cycle here. Instead of Facebook stalking, I did website stalking. And I read on your website all these things, so I'm going to try to convince you to come to Tanzania now. It's like a used car salesman, you know. I'm going to try to convince you to buy a car today. By the end of the day, you walk out with a car. So hopefully that's the goal. Hopefully that's the result and things like that. On your website, this is what you say. The Spencer Church of Christ is simply a group of New Testament Christians. We're united in spirit. That sounds a lot like 1 Corinthians chapter 1. We're united in spirit by our love for God, Matthew chapter 22, Jesus, and for each other. Please allow us to share the wonderful gospel message with you today. This is, when you pull up the website, this is the first thing you're going to see, if I remember right. The first thing you're going to see is this right here. So evidently, sharing the wonderful gospel message is important to you. And as I'm talking about this stuff, I don't want you just to think about Tanzania. I want you to think about Tanzania, but I also want you to think about the opportunities you have around here. So these are my two questions, and I hope to answer both of these. Number one, how can the church here help the church in Tanzania? And the second thing, how can the church in Tanzania? Very, very important, and it's not fair to have one that is more weightier than the other. The first thing is this. You have elders. And you say, well, why does that matter? Do you know how many congregations, even in America, don't have elders? And even the ones that do, if you start doing some research, start looking at the men who are leading the church, they're not qualified, according to the scriptures that we have. It is very rare, extremely rare, for a congregation to have good elders. Not just elders, but good elders. And I'm a math type person. I began to do some numbers, calculate some numbers. And I hope I don't mess any of this up. And for the men that forget how long they've been married, this is going to be good for you. Dwayne has been an elder here for 8 years and married for 57, if my math is right. Russ has been an elder for 8 years. He's been married for 37 years. And Gary has been an elder for 8 years and married for 49 years. Let me go right here for a second. If you calculate the marriage experience and the leadership experience of this congregation, this is what you get. 233 years of marriage experience. We're not talking about all the members, just the eldership and the deacons. And then, and this is the big thing right here, 50 years of leadership experience just at this congregation. You say, well, why does that matter? Let me help you understand something. The oldest Christians in Tanzania have been Christians for about 20 years now. Okay? That's great, right? Let me explain this to you. If you take this congregation and anybody who... Let's do this. Raise your hand if you've been a Christian for 20 years. Okay, take all those people away. What does that leave you with? Very few people. I'm not saying those are not important people, but it leaves you with very few people. Now, not only that, you take all those people who have been Christians for 20 years and you let those people with less experience lead the church. think about how different the church would be here. It wouldn't be the same. And to be honest, you may not have the same sign out there. You may change your name. So this experience, just of being a Christian, is one thing. But you have more experience as leaders at this one congregation than we do in the entire country of Tanzania. Last night, I was talking to one of the elders about the deacons here. And he said, I think we have the best deacons out of anywhere in the country. Amen. And I think that's true. I've been a lot of places. And you know what deacons normally do?
Nothing.
They look around. What can I do? They don't know. They have no purpose. No, they don't have any clue. And not only that, you have deacons that don't even know the Bible. They can't even say the books of the Bible. It's ridiculous. You look at the deacons here, you have special people. And this is the big thing. They have purpose. They're not just wandering around. All right, enough of that. You say, well, what about me? I'm just a regular old member. Well, it's interesting because John, I don't mean to pick on John, but he's easy to pick on. John's a regular old member. And I'm going to brag on him. I don't know how many Bible studies he did before he came to Tanzania, but 2 people, if I remember right, were baptized just from John's efforts. As a regular old guy, not an elder or a deacon. And then not only that, but Matthew goes back and starts a congregation of 40 people. So John, in effect, has affected over 42 people in Tanzania by taking a 1-week trip. Regular members can make a difference. And not only that, you think about just here. You say, well, it's up to the elders and the deacons to do that kind of stuff. But you know who makes the face of the church? The people that they see all the time, the regular old members, not the preacher, but the regular members who have normal jobs, who go about their normal days. And this is the big thing. If you know enough to be a brother, if you know enough to be a Christian, then you know enough to tell somebody else about it. And there's no excuse. All right. The big thing is, you see the benefit in Tanzania. The question is, how does it benefit the congregation here? Because if you bring a group to Tanzania, let's just be honest, it's going to cost a lot of money. It's expensive. So how is it going to benefit the congregation here? Several things. Number one, your individual lives will be changed. And if you don't believe me, I think you can talk to Clint and John, and I think they'll attest to this. The big thing is worldliness and worldview. The first thing that you're going to find when you come to Tanzania is that we live very abundant lives. We have too much, and we take that for granted. And the second thing is going to change the way that you think about the world and change the way that you think about the church, because let me remind you, the church is bigger than just this building. It's bigger than just this area. And I always thought I understood that. And I always thought, yeah, those people in Africa and Peru and India, they're just like me. We're all Christians. But what I didn't realize was that in effect, I actually thought that they were lesser Christians than I was because I was an American Christian. The second thing, you will grow spiritually. And many of you can have more Bible studies in 1 week in Tanzania than you could an entire year here. The third thing, you will grow congregationally. Because congregational growth doesn't happen accidentally. And if you want to grow the congregation, you know how to do that? You grow the individuals. That's that simple. You can't have a growing congregation if your individuals are not growing. It's impossible. The fourth thing, you're going to participate firsthand in the work that you've been supporting, and that's important. You're going to get to see it, and it's not just going to be a little bulletin board back here whenever you're eating your ham sandwiches and drinking your sweet tea. It's going to be something that you can see firsthand. And the fifth thing is you will fulfill biblical command. And this is the big thing. People all the time want to say this. Well, you're supported to be there. Okay, I get it. I'm supported to be there. I don't have 50 years of eldership and deacon experience. I don't have 230 33 years or whatever of marriage experience. I'm 22 years old. I know some Bible, but I don't have the experience. And let me explain something. Craig from Kentucky, he came. As soon as he came, people respected him more in 1 week than they do me in 1 year because of his age. No other reason, just because he's an old man. They see gray hair. And Gary, you'd be in trouble because you might have to grow some out. But, seriously, they expect or respect older people much more than they do somebody who's 22. So you have a huge leg up. And what I want you can say, well, why don't you just go somewhere in the South and get them to come? Because I have 2 minutes? 10 minutes. Oh, that's good. 10 minutes. Wow. 5 minutes. 3 minutes.
Take what you need.
John will say 4 maybe. I don't know. We'll figure it out. This is the big thing. Most congregations don't have the talents and the abilities and the experience that you have here. And I mean that. All right. So if you were to come, this is kind of what a sample schedule would look like. You go to church, right? Then you have a seminar at Kisongo or Arusha. Those are the 2 biggest congregations in the area. Kwamrambo is a younger congregation, but the congregation that we worship with, and in a few years, they will have elders. And it's very important that we get them now to begin thinking about that because it doesn't happen on accident. And then Mosquito River is another congregation farther away. You do these seminar type things. And this is the big thing that I'm excited about if you come. You'll get to go see what Clint and John helped accomplish firsthand at Mongola. And see these Christians firsthand and not just pictures. You can also go on a safari, that kind of stuff. So if you have questions, you can ask me. What would an average day look like? This is probably what we're thinking about if you come. Have some kind of marriage seminar, depending on who comes. Have lunch. Yeah, lunch, it takes forever because they think they have to wash all the dishes as soon as you eat. So you have to wait. Church leadership, elders and deacons, that kind of thing. You have the children taken care of because they won't be there unless the children are taken care of. So you have a seminar for the kids. And if somebody who comes who can preach worth anything, gospel meeting. So that's kind of what an average day would look like. I want to skip to this just because you say, well, what if we come? What's going to happen next? Well, the first thing is you come back a changed person and you help the church here. That's good. The next thing, and this is important, you leave the church in Tanzania and they listen to you. That's great. And they get elders and everything goes wonderful. But what if they don't? What if you come, you spend all this money coming to Tanzania and people say, I don't care. Opportunity. That's the big thing. And maybe you think, well, the cost just doesn't make sense. But if you are never provided the opportunity, it becomes much, much harder. And the opportunity provided by me is not the same as it is provided by you because of your experience. And what's the worst thing that's going to happen? On Judgment Day, God is going to say, well done, thy good and faithful servant, you tried. All right, I have 2 minutes now probably. I'm going to go to Mark chapter 14. I love this passage because some of you are thinking, man, I wish I would have stayed at home, took a nap. Some of you are thinking, I might go to Tanzania, and some of you just don't know what you're thinking. And in Mark chapter 14, Jesus comes up to this house, and in verse 3 it says, while he was in Bethany, and this is the place where all these sick people live. While he was in Bethany, the home of Simon the leper, which, that's a social status thing. That's pretty low on the totem pole there. Reclining at the table, there came a woman with this vial of costly perfume of pure nard, and she broke the vial and poured it over his head. And there were some remarking to one another, why has this been wasted? Now, there's always that 1 or 2 or 3 or half the congregation that says, what a waste. What a waste. Why would we do that? That's just wasting a bunch of money. Verse 5. Notice the value of this. This perfume might have been sold for over 300 denarii and the money given to the poor. Now notice what they do. They fashion their response. Well, we're saying it's a waste because we really want to do something else that's better with it. You know what they're doing? They're making excuses. They didn't really mean that. And maybe I'm not saying that you have evil intentions if you say, well, we don't want to go. But I'm saying be careful about your intentions. Because it's easy to scream waste than it is to be willing to sacrifice. Now he goes on. They were scolding her. Who was scolding her? The closest followers of Jesus, the people who you think would get it, are the ones who are telling this lady, what a waste. You could have helped the poor with this. But I want you to notice what Jesus says, and then I will be quiet. Leave her alone. Why did you bother her? She has done a good deed to me. For you always have the poor with you, and whenever you wish you can do good to them, but you do not always have me. Notice verse 8. She has done what she could. This is my question, and then I'm done. Have you done what you can? Thank you.